The mound rises from the flatness of central Anatolia like something the earth has decided to keep half hidden. It does not look like a city at first. There are no standing towers, no broken columns, no toppled gates where an army once forced its way through, no blackened palace walls showing the path of flame. From a distance, Çatalhöyük appears almost modest, a broad swell of soil under the open sky, worn smooth by thousands of years of wind, rain, roots, and silence. Yet beneath that quiet earth lies one of the most remarkable settlements humans ever built before history had a written voice. For centuries, people lived here in dense clusters of mud brick houses, climbed across rooftops, buried their dead beneath their floors, painted strange scenes on their walls, and shared a world that seems at once familiar and deeply alien. Then, without any clear war, without an obvious great fire, without a flood sweeping it away, the city was left behind. That is what makes the place so haunting. Many ancient ruins announce their ending with violence. A burned layer tells of destruction. A collapsed wall suggests siege or earthquake. Scattered weapons, smashed gates, mass graves, or ash-darkened rooms can give the story a brutal shape. Çatalhöyük offers something quieter and harder to hold. Its disappearance does not seem to arrive as one thunderclap. It looks more like a long exhale. Houses are rebuilt, then less intensely rebuilt. Customs endure, then begin to change. A pattern that has lasted for generations starts to loosen. People do not vanish into myth all at once. They move, adapt, abandon, remember, and perhaps stop needing the old place in the same way. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the balance of causes, but the silence of the ending is part of the mystery. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because Çatalhöyük is not only a story about a lost settlement, it is a story about one of humanity's earliest experiments in living together at a scale that pressed people into constant contact. It asks what holds a community together when there are no kings, no written laws, no streets, no temples in the later sense, and no obvious ruling class rising above everyone else. It asks how people manage memory, death, food, labour, ritual, and conflict when the house itself becomes a world. And it asks why such a world, once built with such care, can slowly become impossible to continue. The setting is the Konya Plain in what is now Turkey, a broad interior landscape that today can feel dry, exposed, and immense. But the world of Çatalhöyük, more than 8,000 years ago, was not simply the world seen now. The plain held wetlands, seasonal waters, reeds, birds, fish, wild cattle, and open ground where farming and herding could take root. The settlement stood near resources that mattered: clay for walls, plants for mats and baskets, animals for hunting and herding, and land that could support crops. What survives in the record suggests that its people lived in a changing borderland between older foraging habits and newer agricultural routines. They grew cereals and pulses, kept domestic animals, hunted wild creatures, gathered useful plants, shaped obsidian into sharp tools, and participated in exchange networks that connected them to places beyond the horizon. The city itself did not grow upward in the way later cities do. It thickened. One house was built beside another, wall against wall, until the settlement became a packed mass of rectangular rooms. There were no streets running between buildings in the ordinary sense. Movement happened largely over roofs. People crossed the settlement from above, descending into houses through openings in the ceiling by ladders. Smoke rose through those same roof openings from hearths and ovens below. The roofs may have served as pathways, workspaces, social spaces, drying areas, and places where daily life spilled into the open air. To imagine Çatalhöyük properly, one must almost turn the idea of a city upside down. The public world was not a street, it was a roofscape. Below those roofs, the houses were small but carefully arranged. A main room held platforms, hearths, ovens, storage spaces, and wall surfaces that could be replastered many times. Some walls carried paintings or reliefs. Some rooms contained installations made from animal parts, especially the horns of wild bulls. People cleaned, repaired, renewed, and reshaped their interiors with extraordinary persistence. A house was not merely shelter, it was a place of work, memory, ancestry, and meaning. Generations could live over the dead of earlier generations, because burials were often placed beneath floors or platforms inside the home. The living did not send the dead far away to a distant cemetery. They kept them close, underfoot, folded into the fabric of the household. This intimacy is one of the reasons Çatalhöyük feels so different from later urban life. In many later cities, power leaves huge marks: palaces, temples, walls, monuments, tombs for rulers, inscriptions naming kings, streets organized by authority. At Çatalhöyük, those signs are absent or elusive. Archaeologists have found no grand palace standing apart from ordinary houses, no obvious central temple dominating the settlement, no royal tomb filled with treasures that separate one person from all others. This does not mean everyone was perfectly equal, and no serious scholar would pretend the social world was simple. Some houses were richer in symbolic elaboration than others. Some people may have held special knowledge, ritual roles, or stronger family influence. But the evidence does not show a city commanded in the later familiar way. It shows a dense community held together by habits, shared practices, household memory, and repeated acts of rebuilding. That makes the eventual decline even more interesting. A city ruled by a king can collapse when the king's system fails. A city dependent on irrigation canals can suffer when canals break or water shifts. A fortress can fall to an army. A port can die when trade routes move. But Çatalhöyük belongs to an earlier and stranger category. It seems to have been sustained by social rhythms that were deeply embedded in domestic life. Its strength was in repetition plastering walls, building over old houses, burying the dead beneath platforms, maintaining neighbouring households in close proximity, moving across roofs, sharing a settlement so tightly packed that privacy must have been limited and memory must have been everywhere. Its vulnerability may have lived in those same rhythms. Imagine the settlement at its height. In the morning, smoke begins to rise through roof holes as hearths are stirred awake. People climb ladders into the light, stepping onto roofs still cool from the night. The plain stretches outward, pale and open, with wetlands glimmering in the distance and birds moving over reeds. Somewhere, grain is being ground with steady pressure against stone. Somewhere else, obsidian is being worked into blades so sharp they catch the light like black glass. Children learn the paths across roofs. Adults repair plaster. Food is prepared. Hides are scraped. Baskets are carried. Animals are watched. And the dead remain beneath the floors, close enough to be remembered even when unnamed. The city breathes through its ceilings. Yet no settlement, however carefully made, exists outside time. The climate shifts. The local environment changes. Herding and farming alter the land. Population pressure creates new demands. Smoke gathers in lungs. Waste must be managed. Neighbours must remain neighbours even when tensions rise. Traditions that feel eternal to one generation can feel burdensome to another. No single explanation fully accounts for Çatalhöyük's abandonment, and that is the beginning of the real story. The city did not need an enemy at the gate to become fragile. It only needed the slow accumulation of pressures, choices, and changes that make an old way of life less able to answer the needs of the living. So the mystery begins not with a battle, but with absence. A great settlement once full of footsteps becomes a mound. Roof paths disappear beneath soil. Painted walls are sealed in darkness. Hearths go cold. The dead remain where they were placed, while the living carry their tools, animals, memories, and habits elsewhere. What is left behind is not a ruin shouting of catastrophe, but a buried question: how does a city vanish when nothing appears to have destroyed it? To understand why Çatalhöyük feels so unlike the cities that come later, it is necessary to forget the familiar shape of urban life. There is no broad avenue leading toward a palace, no market street crowded between rows of shops, no defensive wall wrapping the community in stone, no gate where strangers are counted as they enter. The settlement is not organized around open public squares or ceremonial plazas. It is a city without streets, and that single fact changes almost everything. The houses press tightly against one another, so closely that the outside wall of one dwelling is often the wall of the next. Instead of walking between buildings, people move above them. The settlement becomes a maze of roofs, ladders, openings, and smoke holes. A human landscape where the ground is not the main path. The city's surface is overhead. This roof world must have been full of movement. At dawn, as light spreads across the Konya plain, people climb from dark interiors into open air. Ladders rise through ceiling openings, and the first bodies appear on the flat roofs, carrying baskets, tools, mats, food, fuel, or infants. Smoke escapes from hearths below, drifting low across the packed roofscape before thinning into the morning. Some roofs may be used for work, some for rest, some for drying grain or hides, some for watching animals and weather. A person crossing the settlement does not follow a road. They step from one roof to another, familiar with small changes in height, repaired edges, soft places, hard places, safe routes, and private boundaries that are invisible to outsiders but known to everyone who lives there. This arrangement creates a strange kind of closeness. The people of Çatalhöyük live wall to wall and roof to roof, yet each house is also an enclosed world. Entrance from above means that a visitor descends into a household rather than stepping through a front door. Inside, the light is limited, falling from the roof, opening and flickering from fire. The air carries smoke, cooking smells, clay dust, animal hide, stored grain, and human presence. The walls are repeatedly plastered, sometimes so often that they hold layer upon layer of renewal, like memory made into architecture. Floors are cleaned and resurfaced. Platforms are repaired. Hearths and ovens are maintained. The house is not static. It is continually remade. The basic form seems simple at first: a main room, smaller side rooms or storage spaces, platforms along the walls, a hearth, an oven, and areas for domestic work. But simplicity is deceptive. Every surface has meaning because space is limited, and repeated use gives objects and places a long life. Platforms are not merely places to sit or sleep. Some also cover burials. Walls are not merely barriers. They can be painted, decorated, or fitted with installations. Hearths do more than cook food. They warm the house, fill it with smoke, and mark the center of repeated activity. A ladder is not just a tool of movement. It is the threshold between roof and home, between the open shared world and the interior where family, labor, ritual, and ancestry overlap. The lack of streets also means that Çatalhöyük does not divide public and private space in the way later cities often do. There may be shared routes, shared roof areas, and common understandings about movement, but the architecture does not leave broad corridors for strangers. The settlement is dense, intimate, and perhaps socially watchful. Everyone must know how to move without intruding too far, how to pass near another household, how to recognize who belongs where, how to negotiate daily contact without constant conflict. Scholars still debate exactly how access and ownership worked in such a place, because the evidence remains incomplete. But the architecture suggests a community held together by habits so practiced that they did not need to be written down. This closeness also has practical advantages. Houses packed together conserve heat in cold seasons and create a compact settlement that may be easier to maintain. Mud brick walls can be repaired with local materials. Roofs provide broad usable space without requiring streets below. Building new houses over old ones raises the mound slowly across generations, turning the settlement itself into a layered monument without anyone deciding to build a monument. Each rebuilding seals pieces of the past beneath the present. The city grows not by clearing away memory, but by standing on top of it. Yet the same design carries costs. Rooms entered from the roof can be dim and smoky. Fires used for cooking and warmth leave soot behind. Ventilation is limited, and indoor air may have been harsh on lungs and eyes. Roof roots require maintenance and care. A densely packed settlement makes waste disposal, storage, and privacy more complicated. People living so closely must manage not only food and shelter, but also noise, smell, illness, grief, jealousy, and obligation. What survives in the record suggests remarkable endurance, but endurance is not the same as ease. The wall paintings deepen the strangeness of the place. Some show geometric designs, hand-like marks, animals, hunting scenes, or patterns whose meanings are still debated. One famous image has often been interpreted as a settlement beneath an erupting volcano, though that reading remains disputed. It may be a landscape, a pattern, a symbolic scene, or something else entirely. Other walls display wild bulls, leopards, vultures, and powerful animals that seem to belong to a world beyond ordinary domestic comfort. These images do not turn the houses into temples in the later sense, but they do show that the interior of the home can hold powerful symbols. The sacred, if that word can be used carefully, does not need a separate monumental building. It lives inside the house. That is one of Çatalhöyük's most surprising qualities. The extraordinary is embedded in the ordinary. People grind grain near walls that may carry images of wild power. They cook above the bones of the dead. They sleep on platforms under which earlier bodies have been placed. They climb from a smoke-darkened room into sunlight and cross a roofscape that is also a kind of public street. Later civilizations often separate these spheres more sharply, the cemetery outside the city, the temple above the houses, the ruler's palace apart from common dwellings, the road distinct from the roof, the sacred building distinct from the kitchen. At Çatalhöyük, these boundaries blur. The result is a settlement that feels both crowded and inward-looking, open to the sky yet sealed within households, practical yet symbolically charged. Its design did not happen by accident. It was repeated for centuries because it worked well enough, and because it matched the social imagination of the people who lived there. A city without streets is not a failed version of a later city. It is a different answer to the problem of human closeness. For a long time, that answer held. Mud walls rose beside mud walls. Roof paths extended. Ladders descended into warm rooms. Plaster covered old plaster. The mound grew higher, and under every new surface, the past remained close. Life at Çatalhöyük is easiest to imagine from above, because above is where the settlement opens itself to the sky. The roofs are not empty caps placed over private rooms. They are paths, working surfaces, meeting places, lookout points, and thresholds. In the cool part of the morning before the heat settles across the plain, people climb out through roof openings and emerge into a world of pale clay, reed mats, smoke, and low voices. The settlement does not wake along streets. It wakes through holes in the ceiling. One household after another sends up movement, a woman carrying a basket of grain, a man with a bundle of reeds, someone lifting a child into the light, someone shaking out a mat, someone checking the weather beyond the crowded edge of the mound. From this height, the Konya plain stretches around them with a vastness that contrasts sharply with the density below. The people live pressed together, but beyond the settlement there is open land, wet ground, seasonal water, patches of cultivation, grazing animals, reeds, birds, and the distant lines of low hills. That contrast must have shaped the rhythm of every day. Inside the city, closeness rules. Outside, work spreads outward. Some people leave the mound to tend crops, gather plants, cut reeds, hunt, herd animals, fetch clay, or travel along exchange routes. Others remain among the houses, grinding grain, making tools, repairing plaster, cooking, weaving, scraping hides, shaping baskets, and caring for the young and old. The city depends on both worlds, the crowded human mound and the wider living landscape around it. Food is at the centre of this rhythm. The people of Çatalhöyük are not simply farmers in the later village sense, nor are they only hunters carrying an older way of life into a settled place. They live in a mixed economy, and that mixture is one of the reasons the settlement is so interesting. They cultivate wheat, barley, peas, lentils, and other useful crops. They herd sheep and goats, and over time cattle become increasingly important in domestic life. Though wild cattle continue to hold special symbolic power, they also hunt, gather, fish, and collect resources from wetlands. What survives in the record suggests a flexible system, one that draws from cultivated fields, managed animals, wild landscapes, and skilled household labour. It is a settled life, but not a simple one. The work of turning grain into food must have been constant and physically demanding. Grinding stones wear down under repeated pressure, and the bodies of people who use them can carry the marks of repetitive labour. Flour does not arrive ready-made. It is produced by hands, shoulders, backs, and patience. Grain must be stored, protected, processed, cooked, and shared. Hearths and ovens inside the houses produce meals, warmth, smoke, soot, and social life. In the dim interior below the roof, food preparation is not just survival. It is the daily act that keeps the household together. A pot over fire, a platform cleared for eating or sleeping, a storage bin sealed against pests, a child watching an adult work stone against grain. These are the quiet mechanics of continuity. Obsidian adds another layer to the picture. The black volcanic glass used at Çatalhöyük did not all come from the immediate doorstep. It reached the settlement through connections stretching toward volcanic regions, especially in central Anatolia. Worked properly, obsidian can produce cutting edges of astonishing sharpness. Its presence tells us that the city is not isolated, even if its architecture feels inward. People here are part of broader networks of exchange, knowledge, and movement. A blade used to cut meat, plants, hide, or fibre may carry within it the trace of distant landscapes. A small tool in a house can quietly reveal a world beyond the mound. Daily life also includes care, risk, and discomfort. The houses are close, the air inside can be smoky, and the same roof opening used for entrance and light also serves as ventilation. Soot builds up, hearth smoke darkens walls and lungs. People live with animals nearby, with food stores that attract pests, with waste that must be managed, with injuries from work, and with the ordinary diseases of dense settlement. No single explanation fully accounts for the later abandonment of Çatalhöyük. But the conditions of everyday life show that this early urban experiment is not romantic simplicity. It is impressive because it is difficult. People make it work through routine, cooperation, endurance, and rules that may never have been written but were surely understood. Children grow up learning the city as a vertical world. They learn where to step on roofs, which ladders belong to which houses, which spaces are safe, where smoke holes open, where adults work, where stored food must not be disturbed, where the edge of the settlement drops away toward open ground. They grow up above buried ancestors and beneath painted walls. They learn by watching hands repeat ancient motions, plastering, kneading, cutting, grinding, carrying, weaving, shaping clay. Much of what made Çatalhöyük possible was not spectacular. It was learned in the body, passed from one generation to the next through tasks performed thousands of times. The dead, meanwhile, remain part of the household. Beneath platforms and floors, bodies are placed in tightly flexed positions, sometimes wrapped or accompanied by objects, though practices vary. The living move, sleep, and work above them. This does not mean every person thought about the dead constantly in the way a modern observer might imagine. Familiarity changes feeling. A burial beneath the floor may have been solemn at first, then absorbed into the ordinary identity of the house. Over time, the presence of ancestors becomes part of the architecture. The house is not only where people live, it is where their line, memory, and belonging are anchored. That connection between life and death gives the roof world a deeper meaning. When people cross the settlement above, they are moving over houses filled not only with the living, but with generations. Each roof covers domestic labour, stored food, sleeping bodies, painted walls, old plaster, hearths, and graves. The city is layered vertically: sky, roof, living room, floor, burial, earlier house, older burial, older floor. The mound rises because people keep building on what came before. Çatalhöyük is not a city that expands by erasing its past. It thickens around it. And yet, life above the roofs must also have offered moments of relief. At sunset, when the heat softens and the plain darkens, the roofscape may have become a place of watching. Smoke thins. Tools are put aside. Animals are brought closer. The edges of the settlement glow in fading light. From above, the people can see beyond their crowded rooms into the land that feeds them and the distance that will one day receive them. For centuries, this balance holds below, the intimate house, above, the shared roof, beyond, the plain. The mystery is that such a balance, so carefully maintained, eventually begins to slip. What makes Çatalhöyük so important is not that it looks like the city's people later come to recognize. It matters because it does not. It stands at a strange and revealing threshold, at a time when human beings are learning how far settled life can be pushed before the familiar machinery of civilization appears. There are no royal inscriptions here because there is no writing. There are no carved lists of victories because there are no known kings boasting of conquest. There are no palaces rising above the settlement, no administrative quarter filled with tablets, no formal streets dividing neighbourhoods, no monumental temple announcing a priestly hierarchy in stone. And yet thousands of people, across many generations, manage to live in one dense place, sharing walls, roofs, customs, food systems, memories, and obligations. It is not a city in the later Mesopotamian or Egyptian sense. It is something earlier, stranger, and in some ways more intimate. An urban experiment before the usual symbols of urban power. That word, experiment, must be used carefully. The people of Çatalhöyük were not consciously testing a theory of urban life. They were not drawing plans for the future of civilization. They were solving immediate problems with the materials, beliefs, and relationships available to them. But from the long distance of archaeology, the settlement reveals a question that would follow humanity for the rest of history. how many people can live together before closeness requires new forms of order. Later cities answer with walls, rulers, tax systems, written records, public buildings, guards, priests, merchants, laws, and formal divisions of labour. Çatalhöyük seems to answer differently. Its order is built through households, repetition, ritual memory, shared architecture, and a powerful sense of domestic continuity. This is why the site has fascinated archaeologists since its excavation began in the 20th century. It appeared to offer a glimpse of a large settled community before the rise of the state. In many old stories about civilization, cities come after agriculture produces surplus. Surplus produces hierarchy. Hierarchy produces rulers, and rulers produce monuments. Çatalhöyük complicates that tidy sequence. It shows density without obvious monarchy, ritual richness without a separate temple complex, long-distance exchange without written bureaucracy, and social coordination without the heavy marks of centralized power. Scholars still debate how far the term city should be applied to it, and that debate is useful because it exposes the limits of the word itself. If a city must have streets, rulers, and public buildings, Çatalhöyük does not fit easily. If a city is a large, dense, enduring human settlement where social life becomes more complex because of proximity, then it stands close to the beginning of the urban story. The settlement also belongs to the Neolithic world, a time often described through the spread of farming, but farming alone does not explain it. Agriculture changes the relationship between people and land, allowing communities to stay longer in one place and invest labour into fields, storage, houses, and local memory. But agriculture also brings new pressures. Crops fail, herds require care, land near a settlement can be exhausted or overused, stored food can be stolen, spoiled, or consumed by pests. A larger population needs more reliable supplies and more ways to manage conflict. At Çatalhöyük, people live through these challenges not by creating visible royal authority, but by embedding order in the household. The house becomes the unit through which life is organized, remembered, and renewed. This makes the absence of grand public architecture especially striking. Later civilizations often make power visible. A palace says someone commands labor. A temple says certain rituals are separated from ordinary life and placed under special control. A city wall says a boundary has become political and military. Çatalhöyük gives a different impression. Its houses are broadly similar in form, though not identical in decoration or history. Some buildings are more elaborate and may have carried greater ritual significance, but they're still houses in their basic layout. There is no clear palace at the centre, no obvious ruling residence, no building so dramatically larger than all others that it forces the social structure into a familiar pyramid. What survives in the record suggests a community where status may have existed, but where inequality was not expressed through monumental architecture in the way it would be later. That does not mean Çatalhöyük was peaceful in some perfect, untouched sense. Dense life always creates friction. People compete over labour, food, marriage ties, ritual authority, memory, and access to resources. Human communities do not become harmonious simply because kings are absent. The evidence remains incomplete, and no one can reconstruct every argument, alliance, resentment, or quiet act of negotiation that took place on those roofs. But the settlement shows that large-scale living did not immediately require the institutions later associated with cities. People could coordinate through kinship, household traditions, shared practices, and perhaps forms of social pressure that left only faint traces in mud, brick, and bone. The surprise is how long this worked. Çatalhöyük was not a brief camp or a failed village. It endured for many centuries. Houses were rebuilt again and again, often in the same place, creating vertical continuity. Families or household groups may have maintained connections to specific locations across generations. The dead beneath the floors reinforced that attachment, binding people to rooms not only through ownership or use, but through ancestry. A house could become a kind of memory chamber, its platforms and walls gathering the presence of those who had lived before. In such a world, leaving a house was not like moving from one modern address to another. It may have meant loosening a bond with the dead, with inherited space, with a remembered line of belonging. Yet this same strength could become a constraint. If identity is tied tightly to houses, and houses are packed tightly into the mound, then change becomes complicated. A new generation inherits not just shelter, but obligations. It inherits the need to maintain plaster, observe customs, manage burials, preserve relationships with neighbours, and continue a pattern whose meaning may be older than anyone alive. The settlement is not only a place people inhabit. It is a system people must keep performing. No single explanation fully accounts for why that system eventually weakened, but its complexity helps explain why decline might have been gradual rather than sudden. A world built through repeated acts can also come apart through repeated small departures. Çatalhöyük therefore matters because it reveals civilization before civilization becomes recognizable to itself. It shows human beings gathering in numbers large enough to create urban pressures, but not yet answering those pressures with kings, writing, armies, palaces, or official streets. It shows that the roots of city life are not only in administration and power, but in cooking, plastering, remembering, burying, climbing, sharing, watching, and enduring. The first urban experiment is not a skyline. It is a roofscape. It is smoke rising from mud brick houses. It is community dense enough to change what human life can be, yet fragile enough that one day, without dramatic ruin, its old answer will no longer hold. Inside the houses of Çatalhöyük, death does not stand apart from life. It is not pushed to the edge of the settlement or placed beyond a wall in a separate field of graves. It lies beneath the platforms where people sleep, work, sit, and remember. The dead are folded into the floors of the living, sometimes in tight crouch positions, sometimes wrapped, sometimes accompanied by small objects, sometimes later disturbed or revisited in ways that suggest memory was not finished at burial. To a modern eye, this can feel unsettling, as if the boundary between house and tomb has been erased. But for the people who lived there, the arrangement may have made the house more complete. A dwelling was not only a shelter against weather, it was a vessel of ancestry. The burials are among the most intimate clues the site has given us. Bodies are often placed beneath raised platforms, especially in areas that seem to have carried significance within the room. Over time, some houses contain many individuals, layered through repeated use. The living repair the floor above them, plaster the walls nearby, light hearths, grind grain, cook food, shape tools, and sleep within arm's reach of buried generations. What survives in the record suggests that the dead were not hidden because they were forgotten. They were hidden because they belonged. The floor sealed them, but it also kept them close. This practice changes the meaning of domestic space. A platform is never just a platform if it covers a body. A room is never only a room if its floor contains the remains of parents, children, relatives, or perhaps people linked by household identity rather than simple bloodline. Scholars still debate how kinship worked at Çatalhöyük, because biological relationships are not always easy to map onto burial patterns. Some people buried together may have been close genetic relatives. Others may have belonged to the same social house, ritual group, or inherited domestic line. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is clear enough to show that the house was a place where memory accumulated. Some of the most striking finds involve skulls. In parts of the Neolithic Near East, skulls were sometimes removed, curated, plastered, painted, or otherwise treated in ways that suggest the head could carry special ancestral or symbolic importance. At Çatalhöyük too, there is evidence for selective removal and handling of skulls, though not always in the same elaborate form known from other sites. This was not a casual act. To return to a body after burial, to open a space, to remove or move part of the skeleton, requires intention and memory. It suggests that death was not always a single event completed when the floor was sealed. In some cases, the dead could be revisited, transformed, and brought into new relationships with the living. The skull is the part of the body most closely associated with face and identity. Even when flesh is gone, the head can stand for the person in a way other bones do not. This may help explain why skull practices appear in several early settled communities. Though no single explanation fully accounts for them, they may relate to ancestor veneration, household continuity, claims to space, ritual power, grief, protection, or meanings that cannot be separated cleanly. Archaeology can show the handling of bone. It cannot fully recover the feeling of a hand lifting a skull from the earth, or the silence of those gathered when it happened. Children, too, are part of this hidden world beneath the floor. Infant and child burials remind us that Çatalhöyük was not only a place of endurance, but a place of fragility. Life in the Neolithic carried dangers that modern people can easily underestimate: infection, injury, childbirth, poor harvests, seasonal stress, contaminated environments, and the physical toll of hard labour. A child buried beneath a house platform is not just data in a report. It is evidence of a household that had to continue after loss. The living climbed the ladder, made food, repaired the walls, and slept above grief that has been literally built into the home. The repeated replastering of walls and floors may have played a role in this process of renewal. Plaster covers stains, damage, soot, and the marks of time. It also creates a fresh surface over what has happened before. A house could be cleaned, renewed, and made ready for continued life even after death entered it. Layer upon layer of plaster becomes more than maintenance. It becomes a rhythm of covering and remembering at once. The old surface disappears, but it is not removed from the house. It remains underneath, like the dead beneath the floors, hidden but still part of the structure. There is a lesser-known emotional complexity in this arrangement. Living with ancestors close by can strengthen belonging, but it can also bind people tightly to inherited obligations. A household that contains the dead may carry authority from the past. Certain platforms, certain burials, certain remembered individuals may have shaped who had the right to live there, rebuild there, or claim connection to that space. In a settlement without obvious palaces or royal tombs, such domestic memory may have been one of the ways social order was made. Power need not always rise as a monument. Sometimes it lies beneath a floor. Yet Çatalhöyük resists simple interpretation. The houses with many burials are not merely graves with roofs over them, and the decorated houses are not simply temples disguised as homes. The categories blur because the people who built them may not have divided the world as later observers do. Domestic, ritual, social, and ancestral life were woven together. A hearth could cook food near a burial. A wall painting could look over daily labour. A platform could serve the body of the living and cover the body of the dead. The ordinary and the sacred were not placed in separate buildings. They shared the same room. As centuries pass, this intimacy with the dead gives the settlement depth. Every rebuilt house rests on earlier houses. Every floor may cover earlier floors. Every family story, whether spoken or silently assumed, is held in clay, plaster, bone, and ash. The mound rises because people keep choosing to live above what came before. That choice gives Çatalhöyük continuity, but it also makes the place heavy with memory. To stay is to remain inside a house-shaped past, to leave. When leaving finally comes, is not simply to abandon walls. It is to step away from the dead who made the walls meaningful. The walls of Çatalhöyük do not merely enclose the living. In some houses they seem to watch back. Their surfaces are layered with plaster, renewed again and again, sometimes left plain and sometimes transformed into fields of images, reliefs, horns, shapes, and marks whose meanings remain just beyond reach. A person standing inside one of these rooms would not have seen decoration in the casual modern sense. The walls were part of the life of the house. They carried soot from hearths, fresh plaster from careful hands, traces of earlier surfaces hidden beneath newer ones, and, in certain places, images of animals and bodies that appear too deliberate to be dismissed as ornament. What survives in the record suggests that these interiors held a symbolic force that later ages might have placed in shrines or temples. But here it lived beside the oven, the platform, the ladder, and the sleeping place. Among the most powerful presences are wild animals: bulls, rams, leopards, vultures, and other creatures appear in wall art or installations, not as soft companions of domestic life, but as beings charged with strength, danger, and memory. The horns of wild bulls, often called bucrania when preserved as skull and horn displays, were set into walls or benches in some houses, their curved forms pushed outward from plaster, like the remains of an animal power brought indoors and made permanent. These were not ordinary cattle quietly managed in a pen. Wild aurochs were enormous, dangerous animals, far larger and more formidable than most domestic cattle today. To hunt or confront such a creature required courage, skill, cooperation, and risk. Bringing its horns into the house may have carried meanings tied to strength, status, ritual performance, hunting memory, or the dangerous vitality of the wild. The wildness matters. Çatalhöyük was a settled community deeply invested in farming and herding, yet its symbolic world often seems drawn not from the calm predictability of the field, but from the untamed edges beyond it. This is one of the settlement's most surprising contradictions. People build a dense, domestic, roof-bound world, but on their walls they remember animals that resist domestic order. Leopards appear in repeated forms, sometimes mirrored or stylized. Vultures appear in scenes that have generated long debate. Bulls dominate certain interiors with a force that seems almost architectural. Scholars still debate whether these images represent myths, rituals, clan identities, hunting events, transformation beliefs, protective symbols, or combinations of meanings that cannot be translated into a single modern category. The evidence remains incomplete, but the intensity is unmistakable. One famous painted scene has drawn particular attention for decades. It has been interpreted by some as a view of a settlement, with a twin-peaked volcano erupting behind it. Perhaps one of the earliest known landscape images in the world. The idea is fascinating, the people of Çatalhöyük painting their own crowded houses beneath a distant volcanic mountain, turning geography and danger into memory. But this interpretation remains disputed. Some scholars see the lower pattern not as a town plan, but as a geometric design. Others question whether the upper form must be a volcano at all. The image may indeed preserve a remembered landscape, or it may belong to a symbolic vocabulary now lost. Its uncertainty is part of its power. It reminds us that archaeology often gives us form without language, image without caption, a sign whose meaning has survived only as a shape. The vultures are equally unsettling. At Çatalhöyük and in related Neolithic contexts, images of birds near human bodies have sometimes been linked to excarnation, the practice of exposing the dead so flesh is removed before bones are buried. This possibility has attracted attention because some burials show bodies placed beneath floors, after processes that are not always simple to reconstruct. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the imagery. Vultures may have been associated with death, transformation, sky, danger, purification, or mythic beings. To a farming community, vultures would have been familiar presences in the wider landscape, circling over carcasses and marking the passage from flesh to bone. In a society that placed bones beneath houses and sometimes returned to parts of the dead, such birds may have carried a meaning both practical and profound. The walls also show that not every house was the same. Some interiors were more richly decorated than others, with repeated plastering, paintings, reliefs, horn installations, or special arrangements. Earlier excavators sometimes called these spaces shrines, imagining a clear division between sacred buildings and ordinary homes. Later research has been more cautious. Many of these decorated rooms were also domestic spaces. They contained hearths, platforms, work areas, and burials. They were lived in. This does not make them less meaningful. It makes their meaning more difficult and more interesting. At Çatalhöyük, ritual did not necessarily require a building set apart from daily life. It could be woven into the house itself, renewed when walls were replastered, remembered when floors were opened, and encountered every time someone descended the ladder into the room. The making of these images also required time and skill. Plaster had to be prepared and applied, pigments had to be gathered or made, surfaces had to be smoothed, relief forms had to be shaped, horns and skulls had to be cleaned, placed, and embedded. These acts were not passive decoration, they were performances of care and attention. A wall painting might be visible for a time and then covered by another layer of plaster. A relief might be renewed or buried under later surfaces. Some images may have been made for events rather than for permanent display. The house changed as people changed it, and the symbolic life of the room may have included cycles of revealing, covering, remaking, and forgetting. This is where the walls connect back to the dead beneath the floors. Both are forms of memory embedded in architecture. Bones are placed below. Images are made around. Horns emerge from plaster. Old surfaces disappear under new ones. The house becomes a layered body with skin, bones, scars, and renewed coverings. To live inside it is to live inside accumulated meaning. A child growing up in such a room would learn not only where food was stored or where the ladder stood, but also which wall held a bull's horns, which platform covered burials, which surfaces were touched with care, and which animals belonged to the stories of the household. Much of that knowledge was probably never explained in formal language. It was absorbed by repetition. Still, caution is necessary. Modern viewers are tempted to turn every image into a neat story, every horn into a god, every painted animal into a myth we can name. Çatalhöyük does not permit that confidence. The people left no written explanation. Their symbols may not have corresponded to later categories of religion, art, politics, or family. What can be said is that the walls mattered. They held images of power, death, wildness, and memory within the same rooms where people cooked and slept. They made the house more than a shelter, and the city more than an accumulation of houses. They gave the settlement an inner life that still flickers through fragments of pigment and plaster. When those houses were finally abandoned, the walls did not vanish immediately. They were sealed, collapsed, buried, and pressed into the mound. Paintings disappeared into darkness. Horns broke or remained hidden. Plaster cracked. The symbols lost their living audience. Yet because they were buried, some endured. Thousands of years later, archaeologists uncover them not as complete messages, but as surviving gestures. A bull's horn still curves from the wall. A red shape still stains the plaster. A strange scene still refuses to explain itself. The city without streets becomes a city of images, and the walls, long after the voices are gone, continue to hold their silence with remarkable force. If later cities often reveal themselves through inequality, Çatalhöyük hides its power more carefully. In Egypt, a pyramid rises above the floodplain and makes hierarchy visible from miles away. In Mesopotamia, temples and administrative buildings gather labor, offerings, records, and authority into spaces larger than ordinary houses. In many ancient cities, rich tombs, elite residences, carved monuments, military walls, and stored wealth tell the eye where power has settled. Çatalhöyük offers a stranger picture. Its houses differ, but not in a way that easily produces kings. Some are more elaborate, some hold more burials, some contain more striking symbolic installations. Yet the settlement does not seem to organize itself around palaces, ruler tombs, or buildings whose scale overwhelms all others. Authority exists because no community of this size can function without influence, decision, memory, and pressure. But it does not stand in the open wearing a crown. This absence is one of the most important clues in the whole mystery. The people of Çatalhöyük built a large and enduring settlement without leaving behind clear signs of centralized rule. There are no throne rooms, no inscriptions naming rulers, no obvious storehouses controlled by a state, no great defensive works showing a leadership able to command mass labor for war. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how decisions were made. But the archaeological pattern suggests a society where power may have been distributed through households, ritual knowledge, ancestry, age, skill, reputation, and networks of obligation rather than concentrated in a single royal line. It is not that hierarchy was absent in every form. It is that hierarchy did not yet harden into the monumental shapes familiar from later civilization. The houses themselves reveal this tension. On one level, many dwellings follow a broadly similar plan main room, platforms, hearth or oven, storage spaces, ladder access from above, repeated plastering, and sometimes burials beneath the floor. This similarity suggests a shared idea of what a proper house should be. A family or household might have its own history and internal rank, but it lived within a common architectural language. At the same time, some buildings show greater symbolic richness. They may contain more elaborate wall paintings, reliefs, bucrania, or repeated rebuilding episodes. Such differences matter. They suggest that certain houses carried special memory, ritual importance, or social weight. Yet even these more remarkable houses remain embedded in the same dense fabric. They are not set apart as palaces. They do not announce a class of people living above everyone else in obvious luxury. Wealth at Çatalhöyük may therefore have been measured in ways that do not survive easily. Later archaeologists can count objects, compare house sizes, trace diet, examine burials, and look for signs of labor difference. But some forms of value disappear without a trace. Knowledge of rituals, rights to particular stories, remembered ancestors, access to exchange partners, skill in obsidian working, success in hunting, control over marriage alliances, or the ability to gather people for rebuilding and ceremony may all have mattered. A person could be influential without leaving a golden crown. A household could be respected without building a palace. Power can live in memory, in obligation, in who speaks at the right moment, in who is trusted to handle the bones of the dead, in who knows how to prepare a wall before an image is made. Burials add complexity to the question. Some individuals are buried with beads, tools, pigments, baskets, textiles, or other objects, though preservation is uneven and not every grave can be compared easily. The range of grave goods does not show the extreme differences seen in later elite tombs, but it does not prove that everyone was socially identical. Some bodies may have received more attention than others. Some skulls may have been removed or curated in ways that gave particular individuals continuing significance. Children, adults, men, women, and older people appear in patterns that do not translate neatly into modern assumptions about status. What survives in the record suggests a society with distinctions, but not one dominated by the spectacular wealth gap of later kingdoms. This is surprising because dense settlement often increases inequality. When many people live together, storage becomes more important, land and labour become more contested, and some individuals can gain advantage by managing resources or mediating conflict. In later agricultural societies, surplus frequently becomes a foundation for authority. Someone controls grain, someone organizes irrigation, someone claims divine favor, someone commands guards, someone records debt. Çatalhöyük seems to stand before that familiar sequence fully takes hold. It shows that density alone does not automatically produce kings. Human communities can remain large and complex while keeping power embedded in smaller units, at least for a time. But that phrase matters for a time. These same features that limited visible inequality may also have made long-term adaptation difficult. If authority is spread across households, then collective decisions may depend on consensus, custom, negotiation, and social pressure. That can be stable when traditions are strong and problems are familiar. It can be less flexible when the environment changes, population pressure rises, labour demands shift, or younger households begin to imagine life differently. A king can force a canal to be dug, though not always wisely. A state can move food, punish dissent, or build defences. Çatalhöyük seems to have relied on a subtler web. Such a web can be resilient, but it can also fray quietly. The roofscape itself may have enforced a kind of social equality. Moving across houses from above means everyone participates in a shared surface. No grand boulevard leads to an elite residence. No high wall separates noble quarter from common quarter. The settlement's shape keeps people close, visible, and interdependent. That closeness may have discouraged extreme displays of private wealth. A household that tried to rise too far above its neighbours would still share walls, smoke, roofs, and daily roots. In such a place, status may have had to be expressed through accepted forms: a more elaborate wall, a powerful animal installation, a remembered burial, a feast, a ritual role, a connection to distant obsidian, not through a mansion towering over the poor. Yet closeness can also sharpen tension. A society without palaces is not a society without ambition. If houses carry memory and identity, then competition may occur through houses. Which household has the deepest ancestry? Which one holds the most potent symbols? Which one controls certain ritual acts? Which one has the strongest ties to exchange, hunting, or marriage partners? The conflict may not leave swords in a burned gate. It may leave changing house histories, altered burial practices, abandoned buildings, or subtle shifts in where people choose to invest labour. No single explanation fully accounts for the city's later decline, but its social structure likely shaped both its endurance and its vulnerability. The image that emerges is not of a utopia, and not of a kingdom. It is of a community balanced between cooperation and pressure, similarity and distinction, shared tradition and household pride. Çatalhöyük's people built no palace, yet they built a world that required discipline. They left no royal tomb, yet they lived among the dead. They carved no law code, yet they followed rules strong enough to hold thousands together for centuries. Their wealth was not only in objects but in continuity. In rebuilt houses, remembered floors, shared roofs, painted walls, and the ability to keep living close without letting the whole settlement tear itself apart. That achievement was extraordinary. It was also fragile. A city without palaces can vanish without the fall of a king. because its collapse does not need to begin at the top. It can begin everywhere at once, slowly, in households that decide the old pattern no longer carries them forward. Beyond the crowded roofs of Çatalhöyük, the landscape was never still. It may look stable from a distance, a wide plain under a hard sky. But plains remember water, drought, grazing, fire, roots, and human hands. The Konya Plain was not simply a backdrop to the settlement. It was the living system that made the settlement possible, and over centuries it changed in ways that must have pressed against the people who depended on it. The city could renew its walls, replaster its rooms, rebuild houses over houses and keep the dead beneath the floors, but it could not freeze the world outside. Fields shifted, wetlands rose and fell, animals moved, soils tired. Fuel had to be gathered from farther away. What seemed like an endless plain was, in practice, a delicate arrangement of resources that could be stretched only so far. In the earlier centuries of occupation, the area around Çatalhöyük offered a rich mixture of environments. Seasonal wetlands and marshy zones likely provided reeds, birds, fish, clay, and other materials useful for daily life. Drier ground supported cultivation and grazing. Nearby watercourses and low-lying areas changed with the seasons, giving the people access to a range of plants and animals. This variety mattered. A settlement of such density could not live from grain alone, nor from herds alone, nor from hunting alone. Its strength lay in combination. People farmed, herded, gathered, hunted, exchanged, stored, and adapted. Their survival was not based on a single neat system, but on many overlapping strategies. Yet farming changes land, herding changes land, cutting reeds, gathering fuel, harvesting plants, trampling paths, digging clay, and building mud brick houses all leave marks, even when those marks are slow. A small village may draw lightly from its surroundings. A dense settlement occupied for centuries draws again and again from the same wider landscape. Every hearth needs fuel, every roof needs material, every field needs labour, every animal needs pasture, every household needs storage. Bedding, baskets, tools, and repair. The people of Çatalhöyük were skilled at using what the land offered, but skill does not remove pressure. It only makes pressure manageable for a while. Climate added another layer. The Neolithic Near East did not experience climate as a simple, unchanging background. Rainfall patterns could vary, temperatures could shift, and local hydrology could alter the balance between wetland and dry ground. Scholars still debate the exact role of climate in Çatalhöyük's later changes, because the evidence remains incomplete, and local conditions do not always match broad regional trends in a simple way. Still, it is clear that environmental conditions were not fixed. A settlement that depends on nearby wetlands, arable land, grazing, and seasonal rhythms must respond when these rhythms change. Even modest changes, repeated over generations, can affect where people plant, where animals graze, how far they walk for resources, and how reliable familiar routines feel. The wetlands are especially important because they were both generous and unstable. Wet places attract life. They offer reeds for construction and matting, birds for hunting, fish and shellfish in some settings, clay for building and plastering, and water-loving plants that can be woven, eaten, or used. They also bring mud, insects, seasonal floods, disease risks, and shifting boundaries between dry and wet ground. Living near wetlands means living with change. A place useful in one season may be impassable in another. A channel may move. A marsh edge may expand or retreat. What survives in the record suggests that the people of Çatalhöyük were able to exploit such environments with great intelligence. but no wetland remains perfectly obedient to human need. As the settlement grew and endured, the surrounding land may have become more burdened. Fields near the mound could lose fertility if they were not managed carefully. Grazing animals could reduce vegetation. Fuel sources close to the settlement could become scarce, forcing longer journeys. Clay extraction and construction demands could reshape local surfaces. None of this needs to look like an environmental disaster. There is no need to imagine a single year when everything fails. The more powerful possibility is quieter. The cost of maintaining the same way of life slowly rises. A walk for fuel becomes longer. A field produces less. A herd must be moved farther. A wetland resource becomes less dependable. The city still functions, but the balance grows harder to maintain. This kind of strain is difficult to see archaeologically because it rarely leaves one dramatic layer. A burned city gives ash. A flood gives silt. A massacre may leave bodies. Slow environmental pressure leaves mixed signals, changes in plant remains, animal bones, building materials, storage patterns, settlement density, health, and movement. No single explanation fully accounts for Çatalhöyük's eventual decline, but the landscape's gradual transformation is one of the essential pieces. The settlement did not exist in isolation from its plain. Its social world and ecological world were bound together so tightly that a shift in one could unsettle the other. The people themselves also contributed to change simply by succeeding. Long occupation is an achievement, but it creates accumulation. A settlement that lasts for generations builds not only houses, but expectations. Families know where to farm, where to gather, where to take animals, where to find clay, which routes connect to other communities, which seasonal patterns can be trusted. These inherited maps become part of ordinary life. But if the environment changes, inherited knowledge must change with it. Some households may adapt quickly, others may hold to older practices, some may argue for movement, others for repair. The archaeological record cannot preserve those conversations, but it can show that the old system did not remain untouched. The surrounding world was also changing culturally. Çatalhöyük was not alone in Neolithic Anatolia. Communities across the region were experimenting with farming, herding, building, exchange, and ritual in different ways. As people moved, married, traded, and learned from neighbours, new possibilities entered the imagination. A densely packed roof city was one answer to living together, but it was not the only answer. Smaller settlements, different house forms, more dispersed farming, and new patterns of mobility may have become increasingly attractive as environmental pressures and social habits shifted. The landscape outside Çatalhöyük was not only ecological space, it was a field of alternatives. This is where the plain begins to feel less like a passive setting and more like a force in the story. It feeds the city, shapes its labour, rewards its knowledge, and slowly tests its limits. The people on the rooftops may still see familiar horizons, but familiarity can be deceptive. A marsh edge slightly farther away, a field slightly less generous, a path slightly more worn, a fuel source slightly harder to reach. These small changes gather weight. The city's walls can be replastered, but the plain cannot be replastered into its older form. Somewhere between the crowded houses and the changing land, the first quiet loosenings begin. Inside Çatalhöyük, the greatest pressures were not always dramatic enough to leave a single scar in the ground. They gathered in lungs, bones, floors, hearths, and daily habits. A city without streets could hold people close for generations, but closeness has a cost. The same packed architecture that conserved warmth and created a shared roofscape also trapped smoke, concentrated waste, spread pests, and required constant negotiation between households. The settlement was impressive not because life there was easy, but because people managed its difficulties for so long. Every morning when smoke lifted through the roof openings and drifted over the mound, it carried a quiet sign of the strain below. The houses of Çatalhöyük depended on fire. Fire-cooked grain and meat, warmed rooms in cold seasons, dried materials, hardened clay, and transformed raw food into something digestible and safe. But fire inside a small enclosed room also filled the air with smoke. The roof opening helped, yet it was also the entrance, the main source of light, and only a partial escape for soot and fumes. Walls near hearths darkened, roof timbers, reeds, plaster, and lungs absorbed the residue of daily burning. Archaeologists studying human remains from Çatalhöyük have found evidence that many people lived with respiratory stress, and while the exact causes are still debated, indoor smoke is a strong and ordinary suspect. There is nothing mysterious about it, which makes it more powerful. A civilization does not need a catastrophe to suffer. Sometimes the hearth that keeps people alive also slowly harms them. Smoke changes the atmosphere of the house. Light entering from above must have fallen through a haze. The smell of burning dung, wood, reeds, or other fuels may have clung to clothing and hair. Children grew up in it. Older people slept near it. Walls were replastered over it. A visitor descending the ladder would enter not a clean museum room, but a warm, dim, working interior where air, ash, food, and bodies mingled. Modern observers often admire the painted walls and symbolic installations, but the ordinary environment of those rooms was physical and demanding. The sacred and the smoky existed together. Sanitation posed another challenge. A settlement-built house against house leaves a little open ground for refuse. Waste had to be carried, dumped, burned, buried, reused, or kept away from living surfaces through routines that are only partly visible archaeologically. Food scraps, ash, broken tools, animal remains, human waste, and construction debris all had to go somewhere. Middens and exterior dumping areas could manage some of this. But density makes cleanliness a continuous task rather than an occasional one. In a place entered from roofs, even removing refuse may have required carrying it upward and across shared surfaces before taking it beyond the settlement. Such labour does not appear heroic, but without it the city would have become unlivable very quickly. Pests likely found opportunities in stored grain and dense habitation. Any community storing cereals and pulses invites mice, insects, and other small intruders. They come for food, warmth, and shelter. Cats are not yet the familiar household guardians of later urban life in the same way they become in some later societies. Grain must be protected through storage bins, containers, sealed spaces, and constant vigilance. A small loss repeated across many houses becomes meaningful. Spoiled food, mold, contamination, and pests could all threaten the security that farming was supposed to provide. The evidence remains incomplete, but the basic problem is unavoidable. Settled life creates storage, and storage creates new enemies too small to paint on a wall. Disease also changes when people live close together. A scattered group moving across a landscape faces many dangers, but dense settlement creates its own biological world. People share air, surfaces, food processing spaces, refuse areas, and parasites. They live near animals and animal products. They handle hides, dung, bones, meat, and stored plants. Children play where adults work. Injuries can become infected. Seasonal hunger can weaken bodies. The rise of settled farming life across the Neolithic is often associated with new health burdens, including changes in diet, workload, infectious disease, and stress on the skeleton. Çatalhöyük was not simply a step toward comfort. It was a trade more permanence, more storage, more community, but also more exposure to the problems that permanence creates. The skeletons of Çatalhöyük speak quietly of labour, Repetitive work leaves traces in joints, muscles, teeth, and bones, grinding grain, carrying loads, climbing ladders, kneeling, plastering, tending animals, harvesting crops, and making tools all shape the body. Women, men, and children likely experience different tasks at different times, though scholars still debate the exact division of labour. What survives in the record suggests a physically demanding life where survival depended on repeated effort, rather than occasional dramatic acts. The city was built not only by mud brick and planning, but by backs bent over grinding stones, hands smoothing plaster, feet crossing roofs, and shoulders carrying fuel from farther and farther away. Crowding brought emotional pressure too, though this is harder to see. Wall-to-wall living means that privacy is limited. Smoke, noise, smell, arguments, celebrations, mourning, and work all occur in close range. Roof movement makes households visible to one another. Shared walls carry sound. The dead beneath floors deepen attachment to place, but also deepen the weight of expectation. A person in Çatalhöyük did not simply live among neighbours. They lived within a dense net of memory and observation. Cooperation would have been essential, but so would restraint. People had to know when to help, when to stay away, when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to keep old tensions from becoming open rupture. No single explanation fully accounts for why the city eventually declined, but the hidden costs of density make the later mystery easier to understand. Çatalhöyük did not need to become unbearable in one generation. It only needed to become slightly harder, more crowded, more smoky, more laborious, less rewarding, or less necessary over time. A young household might look beyond the mound and see land where a house could stand apart from others. A family tired of rebuilding in the old place might choose a smaller settlement. Someone whose ancestors lay beneath one platform might still decide that the living need more space than the dead can grant. Such decisions leave few dramatic traces, yet repeated often enough, they can empty a city. The strain of Çatalhöyük was therefore not separate from its brilliance. The same compactness that made the settlement socially powerful also made it physically difficult. The same domestic rituals that anchored memory also tied people to demanding routines. The same roofs that connected households also made every household part of a shared burden. For centuries, the people endured, adapted, repaired, and renewed. But every system has a threshold. At Çatalhöyük, that threshold may have been reached not with fire in the streets, because there were no streets, but with smoke in rooms, pressure in bodies, labour in every wall, and a slow recognition that life could continue elsewhere. The strangest thing about Çatalhöyük's ending is what is missing. There is no final battlefield spread across the mound, no clear line of bodies trapped in violent collapse, no burned palace where a ruling family made its last stand, no great wall breached by enemies, no sudden sheet of flood mud sealing a city in one terrible season. Many ancient places announce disaster with a kind of brutal clarity. Ash lies where roofs fell in flame. Weapons gather near gates. Storage rooms are smashed. Skeletons remain where people could not escape. Çatalhöyük does not give that kind of ending. Its disappearance is quieter, less cinematic, and in many ways more unsettling. The city seems to fade out of use, not explode out of existence. This does not mean there were no fires at Çatalhöyük. Fire was part of daily life, and individual buildings could burn, collapse, or be abandoned after damage. Mud brick houses with roofs made from timber, reeds, and plaster were always vulnerable to accidents. Hearths and ovens sat inside enclosed rooms. Sparks, dry material, and stored goods made danger ordinary. Archaeologists do find burned buildings and traces of fire, but they do not form a single catastrophic destruction horizon across the entire settlement. There is no evidence that one massive blaze swept through and ended the city in a unified event. Fire appears as part of the settlement's long biography, not its final sentence. War is equally difficult to make into the central explanation. There may have been conflict in and around Neolithic communities, and no serious view of early settled life should imagine perfect peace. Human bones can preserve signs of injury, and interpersonal violence certainly existed in the prehistoric world. But Çatalhöyük does not show the kind of final military destruction known from later fortified cities. It lacks major defensive walls, and its dense roof-entry architecture may have offered some protection or social control without resembling a fortress. If raiders came, if disputes turned violent, if households fought, those events have not left a clear record of a city-wide conquest. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives does not support a simple story of invasion ending the settlement. Flood is also tempting because landscapes change and water can erase human effort with terrifying speed. The Konya Plain had wetlands and shifting hydrological conditions, and the people of Çatalhöyük lived near water-shaped environments. Yet the settlement's abandonment is not best explained as a Pompeii-like burial by flood. There is no obvious final layer showing that the city was overwhelmed at once by a great wall of water. Water mattered deeply. Wetlands, drainage, seasonal shifts, and changing local conditions shaped the long-term story. But the mystery is not a flood that destroys the houses. It is a world in which the old reasons for maintaining those houses gradually weaken. This absence of disaster forces a different kind of thinking. People often prefer collapse to be dramatic because dramatic collapse is easy to narrate. A city falls because enemies arrive. A volcano erupts. A river rises. The sky darkens. The end comes on a date. But many human systems do not end that way. They become less useful. They become harder to maintain. Their rituals lose force. Their costs increase. Their young people leave. Their trade connections shift. Their fields no longer reward the same labour. Their houses become heavy with memory but less suitable for changing life. No single explanation fully accounts for Çatalhöyük's decline, and that is precisely why it matters. It may preserve one of the oldest examples of a community not destroyed by one blow, but outgrown by the people who inherited it. The city's own success may have helped create this slow vulnerability. For generations, households rebuild in the same places, the mound rises higher, the past thickens underfoot, the social pattern repeats because repetition gives stability. But repetition can also become a trap. A house rebuilt over an older house carries continuity, yet it also requires commitment to the same footprint, the same dense arrangement, the same roof roots, the same obligations to buried ancestors and neighbouring households. The more sacred or meaningful a place becomes, the harder it may be to alter. What gives a settlement identity can also limit its ability to adapt. Imagine a household near the later centuries of Çatalhöyük's life. The old forms are still known. People still plaster walls, cook at hearths, store grain, climb through roofs, and live near the dead. But perhaps the settlement feels different from the stories told by elders. The wetland edge is not where it once was. Useful plants require a longer walk. Herds are managed differently. Other communities nearby offer different house forms, more space, or new relationships. The young know the roof paths, but they also know the wider plain. The house contains ancestors, but the living must still eat, breathe, marry, work, and raise children. At some point, staying becomes one choice among others, not the unquestioned centre of existence. Abandonment can begin with decisions so small they look insignificant. One family rebuilds less carefully, another leaves a house empty for a season. A room is used for storage rather than full residence. A burial tradition changes. A wall is not replastered with the same care. A neighbouring settlement attracts a marriage partner. A group moves closer to fields or pasture. A household that might once have rebuilt on the same spot chooses a new location. None of these acts is a collapse by itself. Together, over decades, they change the weight of the place. The city does not die in one night. It loses density, then rhythm, then necessity. This kind of ending is hard to detect because it does not leave the emotional drama people expect from ruins. Archaeology must read it through patterns: fewer rebuildings, changes in house use, shifts in burial customs, altered material culture, movement toward other settlements, changes in animal and plant remains, and the gradual reduction of occupation intensity. It is like listening for a voice that is moving away. At first it is clear, then it thins, then only fragments remain. The mystery is not that people disappeared from the earth. They almost certainly continued elsewhere, carrying skills, memories, animals, seeds, tools, and customs into other communities. The vanished thing was the particular arrangement of life that made Çatalhöyük itself possible. That is why the absence of war, fire, and flood does not make the ending less powerful. It makes it more human. Catastrophe can destroy a city against the will of its people. Slow abandonment suggests something more complicated, a long negotiation between memory and need. The people may not have thought of themselves as ending anything. They may have been making practical choices, one household at a time, a better field, a healthier space, a new alliance, a house less burdened by old walls, a future beyond the mound. Only later, when the roofs no longer filled with morning smoke and the ladders no longer descended into warm rooms, would the scale of the change become visible. Çatalhöyük vanished, not because the world struck it down, but because the living gradually stopped returning enough to keep it alive. The abandonment of Çatalhöyük is not written in one dramatic layer, but in the changing behaviour of houses. That is where the clues are found, not in a final scream of destruction, but in rooms that are rebuilt differently, used differently, sealed differently, or left to collapse into the mound. A house at Çatalhöyük was never just a structure of mud, brick and plaster. It was a unit of memory, work, burial, and identity. So when the treatment of houses begins to change, the change is not merely architectural. It hints that the old relationship between people and place is weakening. The city fades first in the habits that once kept it alive. For centuries, the pattern had been powerful. A house would be built, occupied, maintained, replastered, sometimes decorated, sometimes used for burial, then eventually closed or demolished in a controlled way. A new house could be built over the old one, often respecting its position. This repeated rebuilding helped create the mound itself. The settlement rose upward because generations kept returning to the same domestic footprints. The dead remained beneath floors. Old walls became foundations. The present stood directly on the past. In a place like this, continuity was not an idea. It was a physical act performed with clay, timber, plaster, and labour. But in the later phases, that continuity appears to loosen. Archaeologists studying the site have traced changes in building density, rebuilding practices, house organisation, and the intensity of occupation. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single trench or house can tell the whole story. But the broader pattern suggests that the old dense life gradually thinned. Some areas were not rebuilt with the same persistence. Some houses were abandoned rather than renewed. The settlement did not instantly empty, but the long rhythm of replacement became less certain. A pattern that once seemed almost ancestral began to break into pauses. This is a subtle kind of evidence, but it is deeply important. A burned destruction layer can be read quickly. Gradual abandonment requires patience. Archaeologists must compare floors, walls, fills, burials, hearths, refuse, tools, plant remains, animal bones, and sequences of rebuilding, they must ask whether a room was lived in, cleaned, used for storage, deliberately filled, accidentally collapsed, or simply left open to decay. They must notice when plastering becomes less frequent, when occupation deposits change, when symbolic installations become rarer or different, when domestic spaces no longer show the same intensity of repair. These are not spectacular clues, but they are the fingerprints of a changing society. One lesser-known detail is how carefully some houses seem to have been closed. Abandonment does not always mean careless flight. In certain cases, buildings were cleaned, selected objects were removed, dangerous or meaningful features were covered, and spaces were filled in ways that suggest deliberate closure rather than panic. This matters because it shows that leaving could be orderly. People may have known they were ending the life of a house. They may have prepared it, sealed it, or reduced it back into the mound with something like respect. What survives in the record suggests that not every abandoned room was simply forgotten. Some were retired. The difference between a house dying violently and a house being retired is profound. A violently destroyed house is interrupted. A retired house is completed. At Çatalhöyük, the older habit of rebuilding over previous houses may have treated domestic space as something with a life cycle. A house could be born, used, renewed, filled with memory, then closed. But when fewer houses are reborn over the old ones, the cycle itself changes. The death of one house no longer guarantees the birth of another in the same place. That is how a living city becomes an archaeological mound, not all at once, but through the failure of return. Burial practices also begin to matter in this fading pattern. Earlier in the settlement's life, the dead were commonly placed beneath floors, binding households to the same spaces across time. If the frequency, placement, or meaning of these burials changed, then the emotional gravity of the house may have changed with them. Scholars still debate the exact sequence and interpretation of these shifts, but it is clear that the relationship between bodies, floors, and domestic identity was not frozen forever. When people stop burying the dead in the same way, or stop rebuilding houses over the same ancestral spaces, they're not only changing a custom, they're changing how memory is anchored. The walls tell a similar story. The elaborate symbolic world of Çatalhöyük did not disappear in a single gesture, but its intensity appears to vary across time and space. Some houses were richly decorated, others were plain. Some installations were maintained, renewed, or covered. In later occupation, the old symbolic patterns may have become less central, or at least less consistently expressed. This does not mean belief vanished. Belief rarely disappears cleanly. It changes form, moves location, attaches itself to different practices, or becomes meaningful to smaller groups. But when a city's identity has long been tied to painted walls, horned installations, burials, and repeated plastering, even a slight shift in those practices can signal a deeper transformation. Objects left behind offer quieter hints. Many useful tools would have been carried away if people planned to move. Heavy grinding stones, broken items, worn tools, debris, and materials no longer worth transporting might remain. A house abandoned slowly can look very different from one destroyed suddenly, because people have time to choose what matters. They take portable value, leave burdensome weight, and perhaps leave behind items that belong to the house more than to the traveller. An empty room can therefore speak with a strange precision. It may show not poverty or disaster, but selection. The people were not swallowed by the earth. They packed. The mound itself becomes the final clue. As occupation declines, the city's shape changes from lived architecture to accumulated earth. Roofs fall, walls melt back into clay, openings fill with dust, wind-blown soil, collapsed brick, and the remains of earlier lives. The settlement that once required constant maintenance cannot survive without hands. Mud brick is strong when cared for and vulnerable when abandoned. Plaster cracks, rain enters, edges soften, rooms become hollows, then deposits, then layers. The city does not need an enemy to bury it. Its own material returns slowly to the ground. This fading occupation may have been almost invisible to those living through it. One generation notices empty houses where grandparents remembered neighbours. Another grows used to wider gaps. Roof paths once busy become less necessary. Smoke rises from fewer openings in the morning. Some houses still hold life, repair, cooking, and memory, but the settlement no longer feels as tightly woven. A place can remain inhabited and still be in decline. The end is not a moment when the last person walks away. It is a long interval during which the old density no longer renews itself. The abandoned houses therefore give the mystery its shape. They show a city not murdered, but released unevenly from human commitment. They show that the people of Çatalhöyük did not simply vanish. They changed their relationship to the mound, the house. Once the anchor of ancestry and daily order became less absolute, the roofscape, once the surface of a crowded community, began to lose its purpose. The dead remained below, but the living increasingly looked elsewhere, and in those rooms, sealed, collapsed, cleaned, emptied, or forgotten, the quiet ending of the city becomes visible at last. When old systems stop working, they rarely announce their failure. They continue for a while out of habit. People still wake, cook, repair, bury, harvest, trade, and teach children the routes across familiar roofs. The walls still stand because someone patches them. The hearth still burns because someone gathers fuel. The dead still lie beneath the platforms because the house has not yet lost its meaning, but beneath the repetition, the force that once made the pattern feel inevitable begins to weaken. At Çatalhöyük, this is where the mystery becomes most human. The city did not vanish because one cause struck it down. It appears to have declined because several pressures, each manageable alone, slowly combined until the old way of living no longer answered the needs of enough people. Agriculture is one of the first places to look, not because farming suddenly failed, but because farming changes over time. The early promise of settled life is stability fields near home, stored grain, animals under human care, houses rebuilt in familiar places. Yet fields are living systems. They require fertility, water, labour, and timing. If the land closest to the mound became less productive, households would need to cultivate farther away or change what they grew. If herds became more important, grazing patterns might pull people outward. If soils, wetlands, or seasonal water shifted, the daily geography of food would shift with them. Scholars still debate the exact environmental sequence, but what survives in the record suggests that subsistence was never static. Çatalhöyük endured by adapting, and eventually adaptation may have favoured a less crowded settlement pattern. Herding may have played a subtle but important role. Animals require space in ways grain does not. Sheep, goats, and cattle must be moved, watched, protected, bred, and fed. As domestic animals become more central, people may need easier access to grazing land and more flexible movement across the plain. A roof-packed settlement is brilliant for dense domestic life, but less convenient if household wealth and labour begin to revolve more strongly around animals that do not fit neatly into the old arrangement. The shift does not have to be sudden. A community can remain tied to its ancestral houses, while more of its daily attention moves outward, toward pastures, seasonal movement, and dispersed work. Over generations, the centre of gravity changes. Social stress adds another layer. Çatalhöyük's closeness was both strength and burden. For centuries, people lived wall against wall, moving across roofs, sharing a dense social surface, and maintaining houses filled with memory. Such life requires deep cooperation. It also requires constant restraint. Conflicts over food, marriage, inheritance, ritual obligations, labour, house rights, and access to resources may have been contained by custom while the settlement was thriving. But if environmental costs rose, if households became more independent, or if nearby alternatives grew more attractive, the old social pressure to remain may have weakened. No single explanation fully accounts for this, but dense communities can become fragile when the benefits of closeness no longer outweigh the irritations of being watched, heard, smelled, and obligated every day. Belief may also have changed, though this is the hardest layer to interpret. The symbolic world of Çatalhöyük was deeply domestic, the dead beneath floors, animals on walls, horns embedded in plaster, repeated renewal of house surfaces, perhaps rituals tied to particular rooms or lineages. If younger generations began to think differently about ancestry, household identity, or the correct treatment of the dead, the house itself would lose some of its anchoring power. A person who no longer feels that belonging must be tied to a specific platform above buried ancestors can imagine leaving more easily. A family that no longer invests in elaborate wall renewal may place meaning elsewhere. The evidence remains incomplete, and belief leaves few clear footprints. But changing ritual practice can be as important as changing rainfall. Household independence may have been especially powerful. In the earlier pattern, the settlement appears as a tightly woven community of similar domestic units, each linked to neighbours by architecture and routine. But over time, households may have desired more separation, more control over their own space, or more direct access to fields and animals. This does not mean a modern desire for privacy suddenly appeared. It means that the old urban compact may have become less practical. A family might prefer a house with easier ground-level access, more room for storage, more flexible animal management, or less dependence on roof roots shared with others. Smaller settlements could offer advantages that the ancestral mound could not. There is also the possibility that Çatalhöyük's decline reflects success rather than failure. Its people had mastered a way of living, and through that mastery they helped create new possibilities. Skills developed in the city, farming, herding, building, plastering, tool-making, exchange, ritual organization, social negotiation could travel. The knowledge did not have to remain tied to the mound. Once communities know how to live permanently, how to build durable houses, how to manage crops and animals, and how to maintain social memory, they can reproduce parts of that world elsewhere. The city may have become less necessary because the practices it nurtured had spread beyond it. Competing explanations do not cancel one another. Environmental change, agricultural pressure, herding demands, health burdens, social tension, shifting beliefs, and household autonomy can all work together. Archaeology often resists a single clean answer because human life rarely provides one. A drought may matter more if society is already strained. A new settlement pattern may become attractive because farming has changed. A ritual shift may follow social change, or help cause it. A household may leave for practical reasons and later explain the move through memory, obligation, or belief. The decline of Çatalhöyük is best understood not as a solved riddle with one hidden key, but as a braided process in which many strands tighten at once. This makes the city's vanishing feel less like an accident and more like a transformation. The people did not stop being themselves. They did not lose all knowledge, abandon all customs, or dissolve into emptiness. They adjusted. They carried seeds, animals, tools, skills, stories, and perhaps fragments of ritual into new places. What failed was not human survival, but a particular arrangement of survival. The roof city, with its buried dead and wall-bound animals, had once been the right answer. Then slowly, another answer became easier to live with. By the end, Çatalhöyük's old system may have remained meaningful without remaining dominant. Some households still cared for the mound, but fewer were willing to rebuild the entire world it required. The settlement did not need to be hated in order to be left. It only needed to become less necessary than the future opening around it. And so the city's most enduring mystery is not why people fled, but why enough of them, across enough generations, quietly chose not to return. The people who left Çatalhöyük did not step into emptiness. They moved into a world already threaded with paths, fields, grazing grounds, water sources, neighbouring communities, remembered places, and seasonal knowledge. The mound may have been losing its old force, but the plain around it was not abandoned by human life. Families could shift outward, settle in smaller groups, join other communities, establish new houses nearer to fields or animals, or move through networks that had long connected central Anatolia to wider regions. The city vanished as a city, but its people almost certainly continued as farmers, herders, builders, toolmakers, parents, mourners, and carriers of memory. What disappeared was not a population, but a particular way of being together. This is an important distinction, because vanished cities often tempt the imagination toward total disappearance. A place becomes silent, and it is easy to imagine its people swallowed by mystery. But archaeology usually tells a more grounded story. When Çatalhöyük declined, human life did not end on the Konya Plain. Communities continued, changed, dispersed, and reorganized. Some people may have remained near the old mound for a time. Others may have joined smaller settlements where houses were arranged differently and daily life was less compressed. Others may have followed opportunities created by farming, herding, marriage alliances, or exchange. The evidence remains incomplete, but the most likely ending is not extinction. It is movement. Movement away from Çatalhöyük may have been gradual enough that many people did not think of it as abandonment. A household leaves, but relatives remain. A young couple builds elsewhere, but still knows the old mound. A family spends more time near grazing land, then less time in the ancestral house. A child grows up hearing of rooms where grandparents once lived, but learns a different layout under a different roof. One generation remembers the city as home, another remembers it as origin. A later one remembers it as a mound with stories attached. This is how places become ancestral without remaining inhabited. They fade from daily necessity into memory. The smaller settlements that followed or surrounded such changes may have offered practical advantages. A more dispersed life could bring houses closer to fields, animals, and fuel. Ground-level access could make movement easier. Households could gain more space for storage, work, and animal management. Less crowding could reduce smoke exposure, noise, waste problems, and the social pressure of roof-to-roof living. These were not minor things. They were the texture of everyday survival. A grand city can inspire loyalty, but a house with cleaner air and easier access to pasture can be persuasive in a quieter way. Yet the people who moved on did not leave all of Çatalhöyük behind. Culture is portable, even when architecture is not. They carried ways of making mud brick walls, shaping plaster, storing grain, tending animals, working obsidian, weaving baskets, preparing food, and organizing households. They carried gestures learned in childhood: how to smooth a surface, how to judge clay, how to place a hearth, how to repair a roof, how to read weather over the plain. They may have carried stories of wild bulls, powerful animals, buried ancestors, painted walls, and houses that stood on older houses. What survives in the record suggests continuity mixed with change, not a clean break. Some customs may have transformed as they travelled. Burial beneath house floors may have continued in some forms and weakened in others. Symbolic attention to animals may have persisted, shifted, or attached itself to new practices. The memory of ancestors may have remained important even if the dead were treated differently. A belief tied to a dense roof city could not simply be copied into a more dispersed settlement without changing. The old forms had belonged to a particular architecture. Once people lived in different spaces, meanings had to adjust. No single explanation fully accounts for how those beliefs changed, but it is likely that movement itself reshaped them. This is one of the subtler consequences of leaving a place like Çatalhöyük. When people change houses, they change more than shelter. They alter the relationship between body, memory, labour, and community. In the old city, a person descended from the roof into a room where the dead might lie beneath the platform and painted animals might watch from the walls. In a new settlement, with different spacing and different routines, the same person might experience family, privacy, work, and ritual differently. The architecture of life teaches people what feels normal. When architecture changes, the imagination changes with it. The old mound may still have remained visible, even as its roofs collapsed and its walls melted back into earth. It would not vanish from the landscape immediately. People moving nearby may have passed it, climbed it, scavenged materials from it, remembered it, avoided it, honoured it, or simply treated it as part of the known terrain. A mound made by generations does not stop mattering the moment the last hearth goes cold. It can become a marker, a memory place, a warning, a source of clay, or a silent reminder that people once lived differently. Scholars still debate how later communities understood abandoned Neolithic mounds, because memory rarely fossilizes clearly, but the physical presence of such a place would have been difficult to ignore. Over time, the emotional connection may have thinned. The people who knew the rooms personally died. Those who knew their stories died. The house names, if there were house names, vanished. The particular dead beneath particular platforms lost their living descendants or lost their remembered identities. The mound remained, but its meanings changed as language, kinship, and settlement patterns changed around it. Eventually, wind, soil, and vegetation completed what human departure had begun. Çatalhöyük became less a city than a swelling of earth, holding within it the compressed remains of one of the world's earliest dense communities. The people, meanwhile, became part of broader Neolithic transformations. Across Anatolia and beyond, communities continued experimenting with agriculture, herding, settlement, exchange, and ritual. Some patterns moved westward and outward over long periods, contributing to the spread of farming lifeways into new regions. This does not mean the people of Çatalhöyük alone carried civilization into the future, and such a claim would be too simple. But their world belonged to the larger human shift from mobile foraging and small settlements toward more permanent, cultivated, socially complex landscapes. Their departure from the mound was not an end outside history. It was one movement within history's long, uneven expansion. In that sense, Çatalhöyük did not fail in the way a fortress fails when its walls are breached. It completed a stage of possibility. It showed that people could live densely without kings, organize memory through houses, bring ritual into domestic rooms, and sustain a crowded settlement for centuries. Then the people took what could travel and left behind what could not. The roofs, the wall paintings, the buried platforms, the exact arrangement of houses against houses all belong to the mound. The skills, habits, animals, seeds, and remembered ways of living could move on. The city became still, but its human inheritance kept walking. What Çatalhöyük left behind is not a monument in the ordinary sense. It did not leave a pyramid against the horizon, a king's name cut into stone, a triumphal gate, a written law code, or a row of statues meant to outlast the bodies of those who made them. Its legacy is quieter and more difficult to see, buried in floors, walls, hearths, bones, pigments, tools, and the very shape of the mound. Yet that quiet legacy is enormous. Çatalhöyük forces the modern world to reconsider what a city can be. It shows that urban life did not begin only with rulers and roads. It began also with neighbours sharing walls, families maintaining memory through houses, people solving the problem of closeness with ladders and roofs, and communities learning, through long practice, how much human life can be gathered into one place. This is why the site still matters far beyond Anatolia. It gives a rare view of dense settlement before the familiar institutions of later civilization take command of the story. Later cities are easier to read because they explain themselves loudly. They leave written archives, official buildings, carved images of power, defensive systems, trade records, and elite burials. Çatalhöyük leaves something more intimate. It shows the pressure of human cooperation before bureaucracy. It shows memory before written history. It shows ritual before temples become monumental institutions. It shows social order before kings make themselves visible. What survives in the record suggests that early urban life was not born fully formed as a hierarchy of palaces and commoners. It could emerge from household worlds repeated so many times that they became a city. The settlement's architecture remains one of its greatest lessons. A city without streets seems almost impossible from a modern perspective, yet Çatalhöyük functioned for centuries through a roofscape of movement and contact. That arrangement reminds us that the built environment is not only a response to practical need, it teaches people how to live. Streets create one kind of society, roof paths create another. A front door facing a public lane produces different habits from a ladder descending through a ceiling. A cemetery outside the settlement creates a different relationship with the dead than burials beneath sleeping platforms. A temple set apart from houses creates a different sacred geography than painted walls inside domestic rooms. Çatalhöyük's people built a world where these boundaries were arranged differently, and by doing so they reveal how flexible human social imagination can be. The site also complicates the old story of progress. It is tempting to imagine history as a ladder, with small bands below villages, villages below towns, towns below cities, and cities below states, each step more advanced than the last. Çatalhöyük resists that neat climb. It was sophisticated, but not in the same way as later kingdoms. It was dense, but not organized around streets. It was symbolically rich, but not centered on temples. It had long-distance exchange, but no writing. It had social differences, but no clear royal class. No single model fully accounts for it, and that is exactly why it is valuable. It reminds us that human societies do not all pass through the same narrow doorway. They experiment, adjust, succeed, strain, and sometimes leave behind forms of life that have no exact descendant. Its symbolic world remains equally important. The painted walls, animal installations, burials, and repeated plastering show that early settled life was not merely an economic shift from hunting to farming. It was also a transformation in imagination. People had to rethink belonging, ancestry, place, wildness, death, and the house itself. A permanent dwelling creates a new kind of memory. A field planted year after year creates a new relationship with land. A dead person placed beneath the floor creates a new relationship between the living and the past. The wild bull brought into plaster, the vulture painted near human forms, the skull handled after burial, these are not decorative footnotes. They are signs that the Neolithic world was remaking not only food production, but the inner structure of human meaning. The legacy also lies in what Çatalhöyük warns against. It shows that cooperation can build remarkable density without obvious kings, but it also shows that such cooperation carries costs: crowding, smoke, sanitation, labour, social pressure, environmental strain, and the burden of inherited customs all gather slowly. A community may endure for centuries and still become vulnerable when the balance shifts. The city did not need to be destroyed to become unsustainable. That lesson reaches far beyond the Neolithic. Many societies imagine that danger comes mainly from enemies, disasters, or dramatic shocks. Çatalhöyük suggests that slow pressure can be just as decisive. A way of life can weaken not because people fail suddenly, but because the daily work of maintaining it becomes less convincing than the possibility of change. Archaeology itself owes much to the site. Çatalhöyük encouraged researchers to look beyond treasure, monuments, and kings. It rewarded attention to floors, middens, plaster layers, plant remains, animal bones, human skeletons, room arrangements, and microscopic traces of daily activity. The story is not recovered from a royal inscription, but from patient reading of ordinary materials. A charred seed can speak about food, soot can speak about air, a grinding stone can speak about labor, a burial under a platform can speak about memory, a rebuilt wall can speak about continuity. The evidence remains incomplete, but its incompleteness is honest. It does not offer a single voice from the past. It offers a field of traces that must be held together carefully. The site's greatest gift may be humility. Çatalhöyük was once full of people who knew exactly how their world worked. They knew the roof roots, the household histories, the meanings of certain walls, the correct ways to treat bodies, the seasons of the plain, the value of a good obsidian blade, the smell of fresh plaster, and the obligations that tied one house to another. Most of that knowledge is gone. Modern scholars can reconstruct patterns, but not recover every memory. They can identify a burial, but not the name spoken over it. They can describe a wall painting, but not hear the story that made it powerful. They can map the houses, but not fully enter the minds that made a city without streets feel like home. And still, something endures. The mound remains because thousands of small acts accumulated into something larger than any single life. A hand pressed plaster onto a wall, someone carried clay, someone ground grain, someone buried a child, someone climbed into morning light, someone decided to rebuild where an older house had stood. These acts were ordinary when they happened, but together they created one of the most important settlements in human prehistory. Çatalhöyük's legacy is not the glory of rulers, it is the depth of shared living. It is the reminder that civilization is not only made by those who command, but by those who maintain, repair, remember, and return until the day they no longer do. Çatalhöyük's disappearance is unsettling because it refuses the shape people expect from a lost city. There is no final enemy to blame, no flood to imagine roaring across the plain, no firestorm to turn the houses into a single blackened memory. The city vanishes without giving history a clean dramatic ending. Its roofs grow quiet because fewer feet cross them. Its hearths cool because fewer households keep them burning. Its walls disappear not because they are smashed in triumph, but because mud brick without maintenance slowly returns to earth. The dead remain under the floors, but the living stop gathering above them in the old numbers. This is the heart of the mystery. A city can be lost not by being destroyed, but by becoming unnecessary. By the time Çatalhöyük fades, it has already lasted longer than many later kingdoms. Generations have been born into its rooms, learned its roof paths, buried their dead beneath its platforms, and renewed its plaster until the houses seem almost to grow like living things. The settlement's strength has always come from repetition. The same gestures create continuity: climbing, cooking, grinding, storing, repairing, burying, painting, covering, rebuilding. But repetition is never guaranteed to last. It must be chosen again and again. At some point, enough people begin choosing differently. The old pattern does not collapse in one moment. it simply receives fewer hands. This kind of ending is easy to underestimate because it leaves no heroic ruins, yet it may be one of the most common endings in human history. A road shifts, and a town thins, a harbour silts up, and merchants sail elsewhere. A field weakens, and farmers move. A ritual loses force, and people stop gathering where their grandparents gathered. A settlement becomes less convenient, less healthy, less central, less meaningful. No single explanation fully accounts for Çatalhöyük, but the combined pressures are visible enough changing landscapes, agricultural demands, herding needs, smoke-filled houses, crowding, social strain, shifting beliefs, and new possibilities beyond the mound. None of these had to destroy the city alone. Together, they made departure reasonable. That is perhaps the most human part of the story. The people who left may not have thought they were ending Çatalhöyük. They may have believed they were solving ordinary problems. A household moves closer to pasture. Another builds where the air is cleaner. Another follows marriage ties. Another chooses land that offers easier access to fields. Someone leaves an old room because maintaining it has become too costly. Someone else returns less often, then not at all. These are small decisions, practical and personal. Only across time do they become the disappearance of a city. The old mound then begins its second life. Roofs collapse into rooms. Rooms fill with debris. Walls soften. Plaster flakes away. The openings through which people once climbed are sealed by dust and fallen material. Painted animals vanish into darkness. Bullhorns break, or remain hidden in the clay. Burials stay beneath floors that no longer feel footsteps. The settlement that once breathed through hundreds of roof holes becomes still. Wind moves over it. Rain cuts it. Plants root in it. The city becomes landscape. And yet, Çatalhöyük never truly becomes empty in the deepest sense. It remains full of traces. The houses still hold the pattern of choices made by people who had no writing but left a record in architecture. The floors still hold bodies placed with care. The hearths still hold ash from meals prepared thousands of years ago. The walls still hold pigment where hands once worked. The mound is quiet, but it is not blank. It is a compressed memory of human closeness before kings, before streets, before written history could explain itself. What the city teaches is that civilization is more fragile and more flexible than its monuments suggest. People often imagine ancient cities as things built to last, but cities survive only while people keep performing them. A wall must be repaired. A roof must be crossed. A hearth must be fed. A ritual must be remembered. A house must be rebuilt. A neighbour must remain a neighbour. When those acts stop, the city stops too, even if no enemy has touched it. Çatalhöyük reveals that the foundation of urban life is not stone or power alone. It is continued agreement. The final mystery, then, is not simply why Çatalhöyük was abandoned. It is how long it endured before abandonment became possible. For centuries, people sustained an extraordinary answer to the problem of living together. They built a dense settlement without visible kings. They made houses into memory chambers. They brought the wild into their walls and the dead beneath their floors. They crossed their city through the sky rather than through streets. They created a world unlike almost anything that followed, and they kept it alive through daily labour. Then they changed. The vanishing without ruin is not a failure of imagination. It is the evidence of adaptation. The people did not stay because the past was sacred beyond question. They did not leave because the past meant nothing. They lived between those truths, as all human communities do. Memory pulled one way, need pulled another. For a long time, memory held. Then, slowly, need began to win. The city was not murdered, it was outlived. And so Çatalhöyük remains one of the most powerful ancient mysteries precisely because it does not end with spectacle. It ends with absence. Morning comes, but fewer ladders are climbed. Smoke rises from fewer roofs. A wall goes unrepaired. A floor is sealed. A house is closed. A path across the roof is forgotten. Somewhere beyond the mound, people continue living, carrying seeds, animals, tools, and stories into new places. Behind them, the old city sinks into silence, not as a victim of war, fire, or flood, but as a monument to the quiet moment when a way of life has finished its work. Word count 1034. The mound still rises beneath the Anatolian sky, low and patient, holding within it the remains of rooms that once knew warmth, voices, labour, grief, and ordinary hunger. Time has softened everything that was sharp. Roof edges have become slopes. House walls have become layers. Footsteps have become traces. The city that once required constant movement now asks only to be read slowly, with care, and with the humility owed to lives that cannot answer back. There is something deeply calm in that final image. A place can vanish and still speak. A people can leave and still shape the future. A house can collapse and still preserve the outline of a hand that smoothed plaster across its wall. Çatalhöyük reminds us that human life is not only remembered through kings, battles, monuments, and disasters. It is also remembered through repair, through meals, through floors swept clean, through children lifted into morning light, through bodies placed gently beneath sleeping platforms, through the stubborn wish to make a home where others have lived before. The city's silence is not empty. It is layered. Beneath the soil are centuries of decisions, some careful, some desperate, some routine, some filled with meanings now lost. The people who made those decisions could not know that one day strangers would come looking for them with brushes, notebooks, cameras, and questions. They could not know that their abandoned houses would become evidence in the long story of how humans learn to live together. They were simply living inside their present, as every age does. And perhaps that is the quietest lesson of Çatalhöyük. No civilization, however familiar it feels to those inside it, is permanent in the way it imagines. Every city depends on faith in tomorrow's routines. Every community survives by repeating acts that seem too ordinary to matter, until one day they matter more than anything. When those acts continue, a world endures. When they stop, even gently, even wisely, even without violence, a city begins to pass into memory. So the old mound remains, neither fully gone nor fully present. The wind crosses it. The plain stretches around it. Somewhere beneath the earth, a hearth is cold. A wall still holds a faint mark of colour, and the dead lie where their people left them. Above them, there are no roof paths now, no ladders rising into dawn, no smoke drifting into the morning air. Only the land remains, carrying the shape of the vanished city in silence.